Hello and welcome to Sci 333E, Psychology of Disaster and Climate Change at the University of Maine at Augusta. This is the Module 4 lecture video, Psychology of Climate Change. Now this module is going to be due at midnight on November 6th, 2016. We have two readings for this module, which will last for 3 weeks. They are both very long readings. My apologies, but also not too much because they're great readings and you'll enjoy them. First we have Swim et al. This is the Psychology of Climate Change Handbook created by the APA. And then we have Corlew 2012. This is my dissertation, and I cut out some excerpts for you to read. So we have a good sense now of what's happening to our physical systems with climate change. And connecting this to our previous work in the psychology of disasters, you probably already have a fair sense of some of the psychological impacts to the individual, community, and societal level functioning, and particularly with the increase of disasters that we can expect to see with climate change. However, in these final 3 units, we are going to explore more in depth the psychology involved with climate change. And this includes not just our psychological experience or understanding of impacts, but also other psychological functioning. This includes our perception, our understanding, our sense of identity and self, worldviews and decision making, and all of the other psychological issues that are going on in our brains while we are thinking about and perceiving issues going around in our society. Our first introduction to the broader psychology of climate change is the book on the psychology of climate change. The American Psychological Association, or APA, convened a task force some years back, number one, to explore what it is that psychologists already know about the psychological interactions with climate change, kind of creating a synthesis document of previous research, but also number 2, to identify key research questions and areas for study in which psychology is particularly suited to support the response to climate change. A draft report of this document was released in 2009, and this full report book that you have here was published in 2010. So as I've said before, this is a pretty new field of study. We draw from other social sciences as well as from other research from environmental psychology, social psychology, mental health, or clinical psychology in order to create a more robust base of research and knowledge, since we can't solely draw from research that is being conducted specifically within the psychology of climate change, or at least in order to have a very robust look at the history of our field. Each chapter addresses a broad research question and an exploration of the types of psychological research and activities that have gone into this question, and or future research directions that we can explore as we move forward as a field. These 6 questions are, and each chapter again covers each of these questions. Number 1, how do people understand the risks imposed by climate change? So again, getting even into the basic psychological processing of information, but also our contextual worldview of understanding what is happening within our world. Number 2, what are the human behavioral contributions to climate change and the psychological and contextual drivers of these contributions? This does start to get into behavioral psychology, which we have a very long base of, as well as our judgment and decision making and why it is that we do what we do as human beings. Number 3, what are the psychosocial impacts of climate change? And here, this is going to overlap a lot with the types of considerations that we have explored with the psychology of disasters, particularly since we have been looking at a lot of those psychosocial interactions within individuals, communities, and broader societies, preparing for and responding to disasters. Number 4, how do people adapt to and cope with perceived threat and unfolding impacts of climate change? This starts to get into mental health and well-being issues, particularly when we are living and existing within the ambient stress, knowing that that climate change is happening, and knowing that we must contend with it, or we are not contending with it, or whatever else. And number 5, what psychological barriers limit climate change action? There was a great article that was written on this later on called The Dragons of Inaction. So basically these issues that get in the way of us actually doing what we, or at least some of us, know that we must do. It's not always quite so easy to take all of the steps to actually make and affect change. Sometimes we are actively impeded from doing it, but also sometimes we take token steps that we feel are much more effective than they actually are. But okay, I've done what I can, and so don't take the steps that aren't necessarily going to help affect positive change. And then finally, number 6, how can psychologists assist in limiting climate change? So this does look into more policy and research directions for psychologists particularly. As a first analysis of the field of the psychology of climate change, there are certainly gaps in our knowledge and even in our questions that we are asking regarding the interactions between psychology and climate change. However, this book is not meant to be the end-all, be-all of our knowledge within this field. This is rather a good, solid starting point. This was a process put together by a number of psychologists to look at what do we know and where can we move forward from here. Since this report was released, the American Psychologist, as well as the American Journal for Community Psychology, have both had special issues focusing on climate change. There has been a number of reports coming out. There are presentations at our national and international conferences. There's a lot of work that is being done in this field, so it is continuing to grow. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of different research activities that are happening in different subfields of psychology. It's also becoming much more standard within climate change research institutes to have a psychology or a social science team that is working alongside other climate scientists, meteorologists and climatologists and hydrologists and the like, because more and more researchers are recognizing that while climate change occurs in our natural systems, it's a human problem. As we noted before, the APA report doesn't cover the full range of issues or considerations, but it is a good starting point for our field. Now, the APA report noted that in the current body of knowledge, there is a developed nations bias because the majority of psychological research is conducted in the United States, Europe, and Australia, which makes sense because that's where a majority of psychologists are. But I note that this also constitutes a continental bias. In the experience of island nations, and particularly developing island nations, are not very well covered in the current body of literature. I conducted my dissertation research in the psychology of climate change in the Pacific Islands nation of Tuvalu. As you may have seen in the IPCC report chapters a few weeks ago, it's one of the countries that is projected to become uninhabitable due to sea level rise in the next 50 to 100 years. Tuvalu has about 10 square miles of land, divided up into 9 islands and atolls, and these 9 islands and atolls are spread out across an ocean area roughly the size of California, Nevada, and Oregon. Tuvalu has a population of about 11,000 people living on all of these islands. About half of that population lives on the capital atoll of Funafuti, which is about 1.5 miles square miles of land, and it's thinly stretched 9 miles long around a very wide, long lagoon. There are many places in Funafuti where you can stand and look left, and there is the open ocean, and look right, and there is the wide, large lagoon. Just 20 feet away from you on either side is water. So these are very small, low-lying, flat islands, and are very vulnerable, therefore, to sea level rise, to storm surge, and all of these water issues that we have read about over the past few weeks. This week you have a reading excerpt from the results section and discussion section of my dissertation. Now, I recognize that even though these are excerpts, that they're still very long. However, I did do my best to pick out sections that are very readable and to connect directly to what we are talking about in this course. For now, I want to give you a synopsis of the other 400 pages that you are not required to read. Although, of course, if you do want to read it, I will happily send you a PDF. But I do want to provide you with some context for the readings this week. Now, I conducted my research from 2009 to 2012. I visited Tuvalu a couple of times to collect data during that time, and I also maintained a lot of long-distance digital communications with my friends and family and colleagues in Tuvalu. My primary data collection methods were interviews with community members and also community leaders and professionals who work directly with culture and environment and climate change issues in Tuvalu, as well as just your everyday lay person who works a wide variety of jobs and different areas of expertise. I also conducted a lot of participatory observation, attending community events and living in a Tuvaluan home. With these research activities, I was seeking to learn about the cultural context in which people in Tuvalu experience the threat of climate change. The first results section, which you do not have to read for this assignment, is all about this cultural context. And then with that established, we can place climate change into the lived experience of Tuvaluan communities. Chapter 6, which you will read, and also Chapter 7, which I did not include, discuss those specific interactions between climate change and the cultural community context. And then finally, I placed this research into psychology's body of knowledge by using the psychological theories, psychological sense of place, psychological sense of community, and activity settings theory. And all of these are discussed in the excerpt from Chapter 8 that you are reading. So first of all, what did you miss in the first results section about culture and community in Tuvalu? Well, despite the small population of the country, Tuvalu is very similar to the United States in that it is very regionally diverse. Just like New England is American and the South is American and the Pacific Northwest is American, but they're all pretty different from each other even still. Every one of the 9 islands and atolls in Tuvalu has a very strong Tuvaluan identity, but they're also very different culturally from each other. And the people from each of these islands maintains a very strong sense of identity that is tied specifically to the island that they are from, not just as Tuvaluans, but as Niutau, as Funafuti, as Nukulalai. And that place identity is very important to the identity of individuals and families. I think Maine actually has that concept is very understandable because it's fairly common to see a very similarly strong sense of place identity in Maine. Tuvalu also has a very strong guest and gift culture to the extent that traditionally everything is shared. If anyone has a need or even a want, there is no question about sharing what you have. This is true for family members and for neighbors and even for strangers. Taking care of others and having someone take care of you is a very strong norm that oftentimes if you go to an island that you don't have a family there, someone will adopt you and then they are your family forever. I had this experience actually, and even before I ever went to Tuvalu, I was sending out emails to community leaders and professionals that I had found online, asking if I could meet with them during my first visit to Tuvalu. And through email, I was adopted by a family. And I really think that it was largely because they felt sorry for me because I was going to be going on my own and I would be alone. I arrived at the airport and the customs agents already knew which family I belonged to. So that there's a very strong sense of community care and sharing resources and protecting each other. All of this being said, Tuvaluan cultures, like all cultures, change and adapt as new generations are born and as they interact with other cultures, other countries, and with the global economy. Just like the United States is now very different than it was 100 years ago, Tuvalu is very different recently than it was in its past traditional culture, even though it is still very Tuvaluan, right? So the pathway is different. Tuvalu was colonized for about 100 years by the British Empire. It was grouped together with Kiribati, which is, they have a wholly different cultural and linguistic history. They're Micronesian, whereas Tuvalu is Polynesian. And Tuvalu achieved independence in 1978. It is a Commonwealth of the Crown, so like Canada, there's still ties to England. In the 1990s, when the internet was first happening, every country in the world was assigned a domain assignation. So for example, rather than ending with .com for a company or .edu for schools, websites in countries outside the United States will end in this domain assignation. So for example, we have .af for Afghanistan, or .eu for the European Union, .fr for France. Tuvalu got .tv. Seeing an opportunity for investment, a foreign company came in and cut a deal to lease this domain assignation for .tv to TV shows and TV stations. And the deal was for about $40 million over 10 years. This is not a huge amount of money on the global scale, but still the influx of funds meant that Tuvalu went from like the 4th poorest country in the world to like the 11th poorest country in the world. And it was enough funds to start developing infrastructure that had largely been absent before. This was paved roads and electrical lines and television, or not television, but telephone lines and cell phone towers and lighting outside and internet. Everyone has internet. There's been a huge shift in the market economy because of this influx of money over the past 20 years. We also have more students who are getting advanced education than ever before. So there's been a really big cultural shift and economic shift and market economy shift that's happening right now. And so we see a lot of combinations and cohabitation of traditional culture with modern culture. In this context, we have the threat of climate change. And so while you're reading this chapter, you can kind of keep in mind how so many things are shifting, and climate change is just one of those ideas, one of those identities that Tuvalu has while they're in this current state of change and flux and evolution, which again, like all cultures and communities, are in this common state of change. So as you're reading these chapters, here are a few questions and issues that might come up. First of all, since I've been doing research in the Pacific Islands, I've come to realize that as part of my culture, American culture, we problem solve. I can't even tell you how many times I have had given a 15-minute lecture on the topic of climate change in Tuvalu, and someone will come up to me afterwards, oh my goodness, I have never even heard of Tuvalu before, I had no idea that climate change was threatening whole countries like this, here's what they should do. And so again, we problem solve even in the absence of all of the information, even when we don't have very much information at all. So in this example, and again this has happened many times, someone comes up to me recognizing I have 15 minutes of knowledge that you have given me, and yet here are some solutions that I have come up with. And so this is this idea that I have seen again and again as part of my cultural norms makes it very important for me to explicitly recommend that we have to recognize agency and the right of decision making for communities, for locations, for countries that deal with their local issues to themselves. They have to be able to make these decisions ultimately about themselves. You probably wouldn't trust even the smartest engineer coming in from China to tell you about how to blizzard-proof your town when this person has never experienced a Maine winter before. And similarly, climate change is a global phenomenon and everybody has to deal with it, but these locally based decisions about what to do have to go in with the priorities and resources and values and needs and understanding and all of these other psychological issues we've been talking about with climate change. They have to be made locally, because only then are we going to have truly positive, effective, sustainable changes and adaptations and decisions that are being made. Otherwise, anything that's just coming from the outside without the whole story is not going to address all of the needs or priorities, may not even be accepted or fully implemented. So agency and the right to decision making is very important within this global context of this issue of climate change. Now, second, a lot of times when people are thinking about faraway threats, faraway places where the threat is so large. So for example, we have Tuvalu, this place probably none of you have ever been. I had not heard of it 10 years ago. And so it's very far away. It's outside of our regular consciousness, but we have this huge threat. 50 to 100 years, the place is going to become uninhabitable. A lot of people will default to these questions. Why are they still living here? Or why aren't they devoting 100% of their time and energy and resources to solving climate change? And this is a fair question. It's very common, right? And I'll bring you back to the graphic novel that we read a couple of weeks ago, Climate Changed, with Philippe Sguarzoni. And he made the point that you can't sustain panic for years. Yeah, you have to live your life. Tuvalu is a least developed state. The country as a whole is very poor. Individual people in the country are largely very poor, and they live with this knowledge and this understanding of climate change and the impact and the threat to their nation. It's not new. It's not something that they don't think about and are not working on. This is part of their lives. But also, right now today, I have to go to work. And I have to feed my kids, and I have to stop by the grocery store and get gas for my moped and prepare for the big church event that's happening this weekend. All the things of life are still happening, and we have to live our lives right now every single day. We have to plan for the future, yes, but not to the detriment of our daily existence. And I know it can be a tough balance, but that's just the way that human experience is. I can flip this question too, back on you. In order to stop the worst impacts of climate change globally on the long term, and I am talking like on the 200-year timeline, we have to reduce emissions in the United States by like 80%. So, knowing this, how many of you have done that? So sustainable change has to happen methodically. It has to happen holistically. It's a really big job, and it's not something that can happen quickly and be effective, but it does have to happen in order for us to protect against some of these worst threats and these worst projections that are possible. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I do honestly hope that you enjoy the readings this week. I did try to write my dissertation so that it would be very accessible to basically anyone who wanted to learn about this topic. Now, the assignments for this week, for your reading reflection, I want you to answer the following questions. First, describe the 5 major intersections between psychology and climate change as related in Swim et al. This is sections 1 through 5, and of course I want you to cite them appropriately. For each major intersection that is described in each of these sections, I want you to tell me what strikes you as non-obvious within the psychology of climate change. So what is the psychological consideration or example that was found in the chapter that you had either never thought of or that you think most people wouldn't think of? Also, I'd like you to describe at least 3 responses to climate change or disasters that are mentioned within Corlu 2012 by people in Tuvalu that you think might be rare reactions in the United States, and of course cite appropriately here as well. But think specifically, what are things that you are seeing within the responses, the quotations, but also the descriptions that are provided that just don't, that seem to be culturally influenced or regionally influenced and that you don't think would be as common here. Also, finally, within the reading reflection, I want you to say, what do you think are some of the reasons that drive these different psychological responses in different countries? For the applying terminology to a real life scenario, you don't have to look up any further information, but I do, because we do have this case example here within Tuvalu. So I want you to think about those 5 major intersections, those 5 questions that are discussed in Swim at all, and think about them in relation to the psychology of climate change in Tuvalu, and all of the things that are described within the excerpts that you have. Where are you seeing those 5 major intersections? So describe those to me. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. And as a special bonus for those of you who made it this far in the video, here is my doggie, one of them. We had a lot of interest earlier in the semester when my dog started barking in the background of the video. This here is Palangi. Palangi is the Tuvaluan word for white person. I got called Palangi a lot while I was visiting in Tuvalu, and I just thought it was a funny name. So here you go, special bonus.